As we will discover this week, however, just like we did last week, but God just doesn't just use old folks. But sometimes God chooses to use some youngsters that we never would have expected that He might. Last week we saw it through Samuel. Israel was in a mess. They had lost their way. They were just doing whatever they wanted to do. That was called the book of Judges. And when God decided He was going to turn things around and take them in a different direction, He started with a kid whose mama had come out of a great season of suffering to have him. She was so thankful. She brought that little fellow to the temple and left him there, and he served God all of his life. He became the mouthpiece of God to the nation Israel and began to call them back to their way. Sometime in the tenure of Samuel the prophet, Israel decided they needed an earthly king like everybody else had, and so God allowed them to name Saul as their king. Now, Saul wasn't really especially qualified to be the king of a godly nation. His primary qualifications that the Scripture mentions is that he was head and shoulders taller than everybody else. And so they said, well, okay, then he can protect us. Let's make him the king. But the other nations around Israel had long since ceased to respect them like they had back during the days of Joshua, when God went before them into the promised land and ran off every pagan nation that had lived there before and presented that land to them as their own possession. But as they wandered from God, it emboldened the other nations around them, and they would occasionally make these forays into the land of Israel to just grab and run whatever they could get away with. One of those nations you'll recognize as the Philistines. When I think of the Philistines, I think of like the Vikings, you know. They would just show up from the sea and just come in marauding, just doing whatever they wanted to do and grabbing whatever they could, and then they'd disappear again. Well, the Philistines showed up in Israel, and we're going to read about that. They gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Succoth, which belongs to Judah, and they encamped between Succoth and Azekah in Ephath-dammim. And Saul, who was the king, remember, head and shoulders taller than everybody else saw, and the men of Israel were gathered and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up in battle array to encounter the Philistines. This is in a time in human history when that's just how things worked. When the bad guys showed up, bent on no good with their army, then you rallied your troops and you met them and you just had it out until it was settled. It was all settled on the battlefield. Now we've become a little more sophisticated now. We fly drones and stuff falls out of the sky and you don't know where it comes from. But back then, that's not how it worked. This is how it worked. And so here they were. Philistines stood on the mountain on one side while Israel stood on the mountain on the other side with a valley between them. But then something unusual. A champion came out from the armies of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span, past 9 feet tall. You know, he would have looked down on the head of Shaquille O'Neal, you know, give him a little pat on the head because he was well up above Shaq. And he was decked out in all this armor. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He was clothed with scale armor, which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze, and bronze greaves on his legs, and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders, and the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of the spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. His shield carrier also walked before him, and he stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel and said to them, now you got to read into this a little bit, but there was no respect for Israel here. This is disdain and disrespect and disregard. He's taunting them. Why do you come out to draw up in battle array? Am I not the Philistine, and you, servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. And what would be the implications of that? If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will become your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall become our servants and serve us. And again, the Philistine said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. There's a lot on the line here, folks. If the champions meet, winner takes all. You don't know exactly what all that meant. It might mean their land. It might be the people themselves. It might be everything that they have that's not nailed down that the Philistines can carry off. But that's what's at stake here. One-on-one, man-on-man, winner takes it all. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. We're 11 verses into this chapter of 1 Samuel 17, by the way. I think I failed to tell you that. We're 11 verses in, and do you know who has not yet been mentioned? There's no mention of God. None whatsoever. Israel has made their way out to battle with the Philistines, who were an imposing bunch of warriors. And here's a 9-foot character standing in front of them, taunting them. And apparently they have decided they'll go at this on their own. God? He's not even been mentioned. And old Mr. Head and Shoulders taller than everybody else to be king is afraid along with everybody else. What kind of giants you face this week? Now we have to do them metaphorically. I assume you haven't had any Goliaths out in your front yard shouting nasties at you, taunting you to come out and have it on, you know? That would be unlikely. We have to deal with characters like that, right? But metaphorically speaking, what is it that has been taunting you this week? That is causing fear to well up in your heart, to cause you to be some degree of dismayed or despairing, or even to slip off into a dark depression? Because once those giants show up, they'll just keep yakking, calling you out, challenging who you are and what you're capable of. And you may have been haunted by that giant for months or years. Oh, occasionally you get loose from his foul mouth. But in the right set of circumstances, he seems to crop up again and come after you. And all that fear just starts to well up again. We find ourselves sitting among the ranks of the Israelites. Say, what on earth are we going to do? How am I going to get through this? And how long does it take us before we remember to introduce God into that scenario? 40 days, morning and evening, Goliath showed up, talking trash. 40 days in a row, and their hearts melted within them. These were guys that were fighting for their very existence, but their hearts were filled with fear. But then another champion showed up. A rather unlikely hero, as a matter of fact. For he was the runt of his litter, to such an extent that the only thing he was entrusted with was Dad's sheep out in the wilderness. You know him as David. Now there was going to come a day when he would be a real and legitimate warrior and king, but he was unproven at this point. He was a kid. He was Meals on Wheels. Dad just sent him with some bread and some cheese to check on his big brothers who had got to go to battle with Saul. That was how much regard they had for this boy. The word used there could be anywhere from infancy to adolescence. So we've got quite a span. But he was advanced enough in his years that Dad was willing to send him off on his own to make the trip to get to the battlefield, the lines of battle, to check on his brothers and see how things were going. But he was not qualified to go with Saul to battle. That was the oldest three brothers. David didn't make the cut. You stay home, kid, maybe someday. And David showed up just in time to hear Goliath trash talking Israel, God's people. And it just blows his mind. Is somebody not going to do something about this? Are we just going to sit here and let this guy talk like that about us? We're God's people. And as he began to ask questions, one of his older brothers said, "Hey boy, shut up." A little stinging to the pride, you know. That the king, Saul, is going to have to make you wealthy and tax-free and marry you into the family to kill this guy? Why should anybody need bribed to represent our God? Is basically what David was saying. And bigger brother, he didn't like to hear that at all. You hush up, kid. You get back to dad's sheep. Well, words of David's confidence made its way to Saul, the king. And suddenly the kid who had come with bread and cheese gets an audience with the king. And here's what he said. David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart faint on account of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." I don't have to remind you what's at stake here, do I? The survival of a nation. Their freedom. If they got a break, the Philistines would have just made them subservient to them and let them keep their land and keep farming and keep living. But they might have just wiped them out and taken everything, too. What on earth? How insecure and inexperienced in the ways of God is King Saul that he would even consider sending a kid out there? But David had some other things to say. He said, "Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God." He was offended on God's behalf. That these unbelievers would talk like that about the armies of their God. He said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion, from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." You see, this kid has some previous experience about what God can do. And that's the confidence in which he is moving forward. And Saul says, "Go and may the Lord be with you." Yeah, you're a big good... Well, you kidding me? But that's what he said. And then he was decent enough at least to say, "Well, kid, if you're going to go down there, you can take my armor with you. I mean, look at that dude. He is decked out to the hilt. You're going to need whatever you can get." Saul was head and shoulders above all the Israelites, and we got a kid, and they start strapping all this stuff on him. You can just see. He said, "I don't think this is going to work. I'll just go with sticks and stones." And so he took his shepherd's staff, which he knew how to wield. And then he goes down and he picks up not one, but 5 rocks. I think that's the backup plan. I think that's the balance of faith and common sense. If I don't take him down with the first one, I want some backup shots, you know? I'm just going to keep flinging those rocks until one finds its mark. I wonder how many times out there in the wilderness with Dad's sheep had David entertained himself with that sling. I bet he could knock those glasses on Jim Morgan's face right back there anytime he wanted to, you know? We'd knock an apple off of Mark Davis's head. David could have done her. What else are you going to do out there in the middle of nowhere? Their sheep are just eating, so give me some rocks. I'm going to whip some rocks around out here. It's all going to come to play. Preparatory work. God doesn't waste opportunities and experiences that He allows us to go through. David was offended on God's behalf and was willing to back it up in the valley of Elah against a giant. Sticks and stones. Oh boy, here they come, Goliath. Here they come. Goliath is not impressed, to say the least, when this kid shows up to come out and represent Israel. He got no armor. He's got a shepherd's staff and a handful of rocks. But David lets one rock fly. And you talk about a sudden turn of events. You know, the old Philistines, they were bad boys. Hey, yeah, we got our guy. You know, they're up there all watching. You bet they're roaring and roaring. Say, we're just about to take over this whole place. And one rock flies from that sling and finds its way to Goliath. Can you imagine, as he was going down, how the Philistines suddenly turned in their outlook on life? And oh, the gush of confidence that would have made its way into Israel's army as they said, hey, it's all changed. We're going to run these bad boys right out of town. And sure enough, the Philistines took off running with the Philistines with the Israelites right behind them and chased them right out of the country. But the giant came down because one kid remembered what God had done in his life before and said, I believe he'll do it again. You keeping track? You keeping track of what God's done in your life in the past? And do you use that to face the current giants that show up and start trash talking in your ear about what he's going to do and how he's going to make life for you? Are you willing to stand up and defend God's honor? You're not going to talk about me and my Father like that. And run that giant right out of town. Because that's who we are. As followers of Jesus, he has overcome and made us the same. And again, right back to this month of June, we're welcoming our kids to stay with us. Man, they've done wonderfully. I've not heard one kid. You guys have done great. Do not underestimate the importance of those little ones and what God may very well be up to in their life. I think it was Andy Stanley who said, you know, the very best thing that God may accomplish through you is not what you do, but who you raise. You get that? Who you raise may be your best contribution to King Jesus. Parents, God entrusted them to you on purpose. He's entrusted them to you for preparation for what he has in store. Don't take that trust lightly. Grandparents, man, what a role we have. You know, we don't have any of the tough stuff of parenting like we had for all those decades. Now, there's just a different freedom that comes to being a grandparent, but don't just make it all about more ice cream and Snicker bars. Man, point them to Jesus. Make sure that they know your faith stories and that you help them build confidence in him as well. We'll get that next generation up and ready to roll to represent him in this earth. As a church, we have a responsibility to build some foundation that those kids will be able to build on, and that when their time comes to assume leadership. We'll talk more about that. But for now, it's a song by Casting Crowns. It's an old one. Second verse will put some emphasis on David, especially, and the importance of hearing and responding to the word of truth. So, Clay, if you'll play it, just use this song as a time to contemplate those critical relationships in your life and what God would have you do with them. And I'll come back and close. Okay, at 4 o'clock this evening is that Vacation Bible School meeting. It'll be an opportunity for us to invest in that generation that was represented by these who sat up here just a little bit ago. With these eyes, we don't always recognize what God may be up to in their lives. Let's make sure we're investing in them and giving them opportunity, every opportunity we can, to be ready when that opportunity comes from Him. Amen? 4 o'clock is that meeting. 5 o'clock we will pray together again. Let me just reiterate, no forced participation. Just be an opportunity to get together to pray. We'll do a little worship. We'll have some little teaching from the Scriptures, and then we'll just pray. And you won't be asked to do anything that you won't want to do. Opportunities, not expectations. But they're just a different dynamic that we can carry out as we pull off what has been called a concert of prayer. All right? God bless you. Take some time, share some one another's together. Let's go be the church. Have a great week.